Top of the morning to you and welcome to our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. At least 2 people killed following Russian attacks on Zaporizhia. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says Russia is hiding bodies of victims of dam breach. Plus, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi says India completely ready to help Ukraine peace. Thank you so much for joining us on the program this morning. A senior Ukrainian official in the southern region says at least 2 people have been killed following an overnight Russian attack on Zaporizhia. Yuri Malashko, the head of the Zaporizhia Region Military Administration, said the victims were a 55-year-old man from Mala Tokmacha and a 70-year-old resident of another area. The 2 villages lie close to the southern front line, where Ukrainian forces are conducting a counteroffensive to reclaim territory from Russian forces occupying parts of the region. Malashko says Russia fired 98 times at 24 settlements in Zaporizhia over the past day. He said the attacks involved an aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, 5 MLRS rocket systems, and 88 artillery strikes on frontline villages. He adds that more than 24 civilian structures were destroyed or damaged, including houses, outbuildings, and other property. Ukrainian forces are containing Russian forces on the Eastern Front and have not allowed a single meter of Russian advances. That's according to its Deputy Prime Minister, Hanna Maliar. Hanna Maliar wrote on the Telegram, which partly reads, in their words, "Our defense forces continue to contain effectively advances by Russian troops," referring to 4 key sectors in the east, including the Liman for the north, where officials say Russian forces have been active. Maliar said Ukrainian forces on the southern front, where several villages were captured last week, were gradually moving forward. In their words, "We've had partial success. We are pushing back the enemy and leveling the front line." Meanwhile, Russia says Ukrainian forces in eastern and southern Ukraine are temporarily limiting their efforts after launching a highly anticipated counteroffensive 2 weeks ago. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu says after conducting active hostilities over the past 16 days and having suffered significant losses, the enemy has reduced its activity and is currently regrouping. Mr. Shoigu added that Western military aid for Ukraine was not seriously affecting the battlefield, despite the Kremlin routinely saying deliveries prolong and escalate the conflict. Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has argued several times within the last week that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is a failure, told a Security Council meeting yesterday that Kyiv's forces had an offensive potential. Meanwhile, Ukrainian missiles struck one of the few bridges linking the Crimea Peninsula with the Ukrainian mainland early on Thursday, cutting off one of the main supply routes for Russian occupation forces in southern Ukraine as Kyiv pushes to drive them out. Russian state-owned media cited investigations saying 4 missiles were fired by Ukrainian forces at the bridge. Now, Russia's news agency quoted transport officials installed by Moscow saying repairs could take weeks. Traffic queues built up and many bus routes were cancelled or severely delayed. Ukraine is attacking Russian supply lines to disrupt Moscow's defense of occupied territory in the south, where Kyiv is in the early stages of the most ambitious counteroffensive of the war. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia has formed special groups to collect and hide bodies of people killed in the aftermath of the breach this month of the Kakhovka Dam breach in southern Ukraine. Now, Ukraine and Russia have accused each other of destroying that dam in Kherson, partly occupied by Russian troops. President Zelensky describes the situation in Russian-occupied parts of the region as catastrophic, to put it mildly.
Of course, we also have information about what is happening in the occupied part of the Kherson region. To describe it, even the word catastrophe is not strong enough. The Russian evil has formed special groups there to remove and obviously hide the victims' bodies.
President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. His counterpart in the United States, President Joe Biden, and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi hailed a new era in their country's relationship after the White House rolled out the red carpet for the Indian Prime Minister. Though the countries are not formal treaty-bound allies and India has long relished its independence, Washington wants Delhi to be a strategic counterweight to China. During Modi's visit, the two countries announced agreements on semiconductors, critical minerals, technology, space cooperation, defense cooperation, and sales.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for your partnership and your friendship. And to all, please join me in a toast, but I don't know if we have any glasses. Please join me in a toast. Here it comes. The good news for both of us, neither of us drink. That is what? Ginger ale, okay. Mr. Prime Minister, I had an Irish grandfather named Ambrose Finnegan, and he used to say that when you give a toast and you don't have any alcohol in your glass, you must do it with your left hand. You think I'm kidding, I'm not. Toast to our partnership, to our people, to the possibilities that lie ahead, to two great friends, two great nations, and two great powers. Cheers.
प्रधानमंत्री जी आपकी साझेदारी के लिए धन्यवाद आप सभी को मेरा अनुरोध है कि आप सब अपना ग्लास
President of the USA, Joe Biden. Meanwhile, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has promised to work towards peace in Ukraine on a visit to Washington that has hoped for New Delhi to break with Russia. Speaking to reporters at the White House, Mr. Modi said in his words, "From the very beginning of the events in Ukraine, India has put an emphasis on the resolution of disputes, dialogue, and diplomacy. We are completely ready to contribute in any way we can to restore peace." Now let's talk to Mr. Henrik Larsen, Senior Researcher, PhD, Center for Security Studies, who joins us from Zurich in Switzerland. It's good to have you with us this morning.
Good to see you.
Likewise, likewise. Now, before we go to the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London, we saw U.S. President Joe Biden toasting with ginger ale instead of liquor, but sending a message of the solidarity between the United States and India. Now, we know that India has been one of the, could you use the word ally, or should we use the word partners, or should we use the word friends of Russia as far as trade goes? We know that India is buying Russian oil or something to that effect. In this meeting between the United States and India, not much was said in the way of how India would stop its trade and business with Russia to also accentuate the sanctions that other countries are placing on Russia because of the invasion.
Yeah, you're completely right. I mean, India is an economic partner of Russia, and although it does buy into the principle of non-aggression, it has not shown willing to really show any consequences to that in the relationship with Russia. For its own reasons, I mean, it's a part of this, wants to be a leader in the what is now known as the global south, and one way to mark its position is exactly showing agnosticism in supporting Western agenda. So even though it might agree in principle that non-aggression is bad and Russia is the clear perpetrator and Ukraine is the victim, it has reservations against following the Western foreign policy, because Western foreign policy is staunchly anti-Russian and pro-Ukrainian, so they try to position them somewhere in the middle.
How then do countries such as India, such as Hungary, who are sovereign nations in their own right, of course, that goes without saying, and have their own foreign policy, having this conflict between Russia and Ukraine thrust on them, knowing that they want to protect, number one, themselves, the trade. Some of these countries didn't have particular problems with Russia, but this problem with Ukraine has put them in a position where they have to make a decision and take sides. Is this fair?
I mean, in the case of India, they, as you say, they're a sovereign country. They are entitled to take the foreign policy decision they would like, and the other consequences of that in their relationship to the Western states. In the case of Hungary, it's a little bit different. They are a member of the European Union and they're a member of NATO, and most of the allies of NATO and most of the members of the European Union support Ukraine and do not support Russia. So in the case of Hungary, it does put them in a bit of a peculiar situation where you ask yourself, why are you members of the EU and why are you members of NATO if you do not follow the line of these organizations in foreign policy? Indeed.
Now, to the Ukraine conference, the Conference for the Recovery of Ukraine in the UK, it reads like a roll call of the allies of President Zelensky. He said they've talked about how much money that they expect to raise from the charity of these countries. What were your initial impressions when this group got together and Rishi Sunak spearheaded this endeavor?
Well, I had maybe expected that they would commit more, as I had read from the media. Only 60 billion were committed to Ukraine, which is not a lot. They need, the estimates go between $500 billion and $1 trillion that is needed to reconstruct Ukraine and make Ukraine survive financially during the war, because without the Western finances, the state would collapse. There would be no salaries to pay to people that are employed. But that said, I think it's actually quite wise to be a little bit agnostic in the support for Ukraine, because Ukraine has huge domestic problems. And we're talking about domestic politics, we're talking about the economy, corruption especially. It's a huge problem in Ukraine. So it does make a great deal of sense to be a bit cautious about what you commit to Ukraine, because once you have committed the money, you lose the leverage. So it's good. You can commit, but then you need to have the conditions that Ukraine needs to fulfill in return for that enormous investment that the Western countries are making. I mean, this is a taxpayer's money at the end of the day. So decision makers, Western leaders have to think about how they maximize returns on that investment.
Yes, indeed. It's not as though these countries can just go to their central banks and print money and hand it over to Ukraine. They're taking it from somewhere, and there's a vacuum being filled. One takes into account the problems that the UK has with inflation and the problems that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak inherited from Boris Johnson. Now, these countries, for instance, it's for the recovery, but for the aid that is going on, for the weapons that are being supplied, these weapons given by Germany, by Poland, by the UK, by Australia, they're taking it from somewhere, thereby leaving a vacuum that needs to be replenished. These countries also have to go through their parliaments, although overwhelmingly these countries' parliaments are in support of Ukraine. But do you see a situation where they have to begin to explain more to the people why the Ukrainian support should continue, even though their economies have problems of their own?
Yeah, that's definitely a risk. I think the Western publics are generally committed to helping Ukraine. I think the solidarity probably can last another 1-2 years, and then we have to see. I mean, you talked about military aid. The main question here is the U.S. presidential election, of course, and the possibility of a return of Donald Trump to the White House, which would put in question the U.S. Military support to Ukraine. The United States is the by far biggest military contributor to Ukraine. I'm not sure how much the Ukrainians could resist Russians had it not been for the U.S. military support.
Yes, and that military support has come in the way of aid in the billions of dollars for Ukraine via the U.S. Now that we're talking about the elections in the United States next year, if it does happen that President Donald Trump becomes president again and takes over the reins of power, and Joe Biden takes a back seat, and the Republican Party is once again at the helm, everyone says, and you've just said, that support for Ukraine will wane. Do you really see that happening? We have a bipartisan Congress in the United States, so the Democrats still have certain leeway.
Yeah, I mean, it's who controls the White House and who has the majorities in the U.S. Congress. So if you see a shift to the Republicans, I think you can. That's probably what Putin is, Russian President Putin is betting on, exactly this kind of scenario. I'm not sure Donald Trump actually would cut support for Ukraine, but it puts it into question. He has said he could end the war in 24 hours. He's probably inclined to ending the conflict, because in Donald Trump's understanding, the main competitor to the United States is not Russia, it's China. Of course, Joe Biden and the Democrats tend to agree with that, but they have more emphasis on the Russian threat.
When he says that, yeah, please go on.
Yeah, much more emphasis on Russia than Republicans have, and much more emphasis on preserving NATO and focusing on Europe than the Republicans have, that are more focused on China and the economy, which plays into the domestic politics of the United States. So I'm not saying that Donald Trump would cut the support for Ukraine, but there is this risk. And I mean, Zelensky probably, yeah, of course, he would like Joe Biden to win the election.
This support for Ukraine, you mentioned something I picked up on. You said after a year or 2 years, we've already seen some form of dissent in Germany, not a whole number, given if you go by the reports from people living in Germany about their disapproval of how the German government seems to be gung-ho, no holds barred, protecting and supporting Ukraine. But further down the road, a year, God forbid, no one wants it to go a year further than this, or 2 years, do you see real problems in these countries such as Germany, and such as countries where the farmers are suffering because of the supply and the availability of Ukrainian grain or produce that's making the agriculture sectors of these nations suffer?
I don't see this risk in Europe, honestly. I think it's more a U.S. problem, this kind of domestic, focusing on the domestic base. As when you take the example of Germany, it's more the culture of military restraint, which comes from World War II. I think this is the major problem, or the wish to resume trade relations with Russia, but then so it's not the wider public, it's more an elite interest, actually. Very wealthy people in the business world that want to reconnect with Russia. It's not so much an electoral problem. There's a general, in Europe, like discontent and strong dislike of what Russia has done. I mean, the entire philosophy in Europe, on the European continent, is no more World War II, no more aggression. Wars of aggression are forbidden. And what Russia has done is exactly a violation of that principle. And so this culture in Europe is being reproduced by movies and through our education systems, that these kind of wars of aggression do no good. It leaves no winners. And that's why the European countries are so supportive of Ukraine, because they want to defend that principle. Of course, you could say they should have come out of it already in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. They should have seen that this was coming. But now it's such a blatant attack. The lies are so outrageous on Russia's side that the outrage, the European outrage, is driving policy. I think it's quite sustainable over time. I'm more worried about the United States. The Europeans can definitely keep Ukraine financially afloat if they want to. They have the means for that, but they do not have the military capability. So that's why the United States is so important. And without security, there will be no economic growth in Ukraine.
You say the lies from Russia are so outrageous. Which lies? Is it the Nazification of Ukraine by the by President Zelensky and his party, as President Putin have accused them of? Is it the going after pro-Russian elements in Ukraine and the victimization of pro-Russian people in Ukraine before this conflict?
Yeah, all the reasons that you mentioned. Denazification. I mean, the president of Ukraine is Jewish, so how can you talk about denazification? Or the argument that NATO expansion, integrating Ukraine into NATO, could be used for as a base for an attack against Russia. I think it's outrageous. There is no proof whatsoever that NATO would attack Russia using Ukraine as a base. And then you see you see at the same time that Russia has no problem accepting Finland as a member with a 1,300 kilometers border. That's no problem. But Ukraine in NATO is a problem. It doesn't make sense. It may work for the domestic consumption. The propaganda might work domestically. I think it is working to a large extent. But in the Western publics, it's simply too outrageous. Yeah, Russia had some soft power, as you might call it, before 2022. I think it has lost it all. I mean, you used to see far-right party leaders in Europe befriending Putin, or going to Moscow to meet with Putin, including Marine Le Pen of France. But no one would dare to do that anymore because no one wants to be seen with such a regime that is so outrageously lying and finding pretext for its war of aggression.
But the danger therein is obviously the escalation and the prolonging of this conflict. If everyone says, "Oh, we're outraged and we're appalled, it's abhorrent, we don't want to talk with such an aggressor," then who will be the mediator? Let's x-ray for a moment this NATO bid by Ukraine. We know that it's a historic disagreement and dispute. I understand that as far back as in the dissolution of the USSR, it's one of the grouses that Gorbachev had with the United States, where he said that he didn't trust the United States, that the United States had given their word, or something to that effect, that they would not support a NATO bid by Ukraine. And look down the line, they feel that there's a betrayal. So what is this issue? Does Putin really think that NATO could in any way actually attack Russia, even if Ukraine was a member of NATO? Or it's an emotional knee-jerk reaction? They don't want Ukraine to become that powerful.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that probably the West broke some. There was no promises giving explicit, but maybe the spirit on the Russian Soviet side, the expectation was we agreed to peaceful resolution to the Cold War, and there was it was not even on the table at the time, 30 years ago, that NATO should expand, because it was unthinkable. So I would be sympathetic to that. NATO should, well, I mean, nothing is in stone, but maybe the Ukraine and Georgia enlargement should not have been, this promise to integrate them should never have been given, because, I mean, it did sour the relations between Russia and the West to a significant degree. But was it the reason why the war broke out? No, I don't think so. I mean, there was no imminent threat against Russia. There was nothing that said that NATO would in any way put troops in Ukraine if Ukraine were to become a member, or let alone attack Russia. The suggestion is ludicrous.
Finally, Mr. Larsen, you're in Switzerland, a country admired by many for their non-aligned status and some issues. We saw where Switzerland was during World War II and I. What's the feeling in Switzerland at the moment concerning the Ukraine and Russia conflict? We know that there's a leaning towards Ukraine.
Yeah, as you know, Switzerland is neither member of the EU nor of NATO, so they have foreign policy autonomy that they could use. But of course, the level of economic integration with the states around do not compel. I mean, there's a limit to how autonomous you can be. But as you know, the main issue is, can weapons produced in Switzerland sold to Germany, for instance, can Germany then re-export them to Ukraine? And that Switzerland has said no, because that is in breach of our neutrality. So this is what most NATO allies are looking at, this if Switzerland would allow the re-exportation of arms. I mean, yeah, Switzerland has a long history of neutrality. So expecting Switzerland to give up that neutrality or it's difficult. They have to, Switzerland's existence has been guaranteed for 200 years by neutrality. They were never invaded. So expecting them to give up on neutrality is, well, there are at least two sides to that debate.
Indeed. Thank you so much for your insight, Mr. Larsen. Henrik Larsen, Senior Researcher at PhD Center for Security Studies in Zurich, who joined us from Switzerland. Much obliged.
Thank you.
After the break, United Nations adds Russia to global list of offenders for killing children in Ukraine. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. A senior Pentagon official says the United States military believes cluster munitions will be useful for Ukraine in pushing back against Russian forces, but they have not been approved for Kyiv yet because of congressional restrictions and concerns from allies. Now, Kyiv has urged members of Congress to press Biden's administration to approve sending dual-purpose conventional improved munitions, DPICMs. The cluster munitions, banned by more than 120 countries, normally release large numbers of bomblets that can kill indiscriminately over a wide area, threatening civilians. Laura Cooper, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense focusing on Russia and Ukraine, told lawmakers during a congressional hearing, in her words, "Our military analysts have confirmed that DPICMs will be useful, especially against dug-in Russian positions on the battlefield." Cooper added, the reason why you have not seen a move forward in that direction relates to both the existing congressional restrictions on the provision of such weapons and concerns about allied unity. The United Nations added Russia to a global list of offenders for killing 136 children in Ukraine in 2022. That's according to a report to the UN Security Council. According to the UN report, Russian forces and affiliated groups maimed 518 children and carried out 480 attacks on Ukrainian schools and hospitals. Russia's military also used 91 children as human shields, according to the United Nations. Russia has previously denied targeting civilians. The UN also accused the Ukrainian military of killing 80 children, injuring 175, and carrying out 212 attacks on schools and hospitals. Ukraine wasn't added to the global list of offenders. The report was written by Virginia Gamba, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' Special Representative for Children and Armed Conflict. Last month, Gamba reportedly visited Ukraine and Russia, where she met with Maria Vova-Belova, the Russian official wanted by the ICC, International Criminal Court, for an alleged scheme to deport Ukrainian children to Russia. According to Ukrainian government portal Children of War, Russia's full-scale invasion has killed 490 children and wounded 1,028 as of June 2023. The Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says the contested site of a proposed Russian embassy was secure after it emerged a Russian diplomat was squatting on the land following the government's decision to cancel the lease. Earlier this month, Australia passed a law to prevent Russia from moving its embassy from a Canberra suburb to a prime site close to Parliament and the Chinese embassy, citing national security concerns. However, the Russian embassy in Canberra did not immediately respond to the request for comment. Moscow earlier this week barred 48 Australians from entering Russia in what it said was retaliation for Australia's own long-running sanction regime against the country.
The national security threat that was represented by a Russian embassy on site are not the same as some bloke standing on a blade of grass on the site that we don't see really as a threat to our national security. We anticipated that Russia would not be happy with our response. We expected that, but we're very confident of our position, and processes are underway for the Commonwealth to formalise possession of the site.
When we return, we'll have Ini John Mecca of our business desk to deduce how the war affects the world of business. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. And as the conflict continues, leaders have gathered in Paris for a climate summit, hoping to raise finance for a new pact. Some of these countries are aligned with supporting Ukraine, amongst them Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu, as well as the Egyptian President, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, and other key players such as the World Bank and the United Nations.
Host of the summit, French President Emmanuel Macron, welcoming the leaders earlier today, said the private sector international organizations need to act immediately to change how the global financial system works or risk losing the trust of the people.
Bien, mesdames et messieurs, je vais demander à la... Les inégalités augmentent.
The summit in Paris hopes to pin down a roadmap for easing the debt burdens of low-income countries while freeing up more funds for climate financing. Though binding decisions are not expected, officials involved in the summit's planning say that some strong commitments should be made about financing poor countries.
And we speak for a complete transformation of securing the sources of capital, as unpopular as it might be to voice it. We do not ask for the bankruptcy of private companies. That's not our wish. But we do ask for everybody to share the burden so that we can share the bounty.
You must make polluters pay. You must cancel the debt and get grant-based climate finance to global south countries so that they are no longer forced to pay for a crisis they did not create. You must be thinking in trillions, not billions. You must help us get real loss and damage funds to flow to those communities who need it the most. And we must remember that more fossil fuels only means more loss and damage.
Addressing leaders at the summit, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa called for additional innovative funding to aid with South Africa's energy crisis.
90% of our energy.
Despite successfully securing $8.5 billion through the Just Energy Transition Partnership, President Ramaphosa highlighted the requirement for a supplementary $98 billion to facilitate the country's transition into clean energy.
We did arrive at a deal, the JETP deal, with a number of countries, and we found this to be a pioneering deal, quite historic, in that an amount of $8.5 billion was committed to support our transition to clean energy.
His comment also reiterated the challenge African countries face with unprecedented financing squeeze, forcing them to focus on managing debt rather than development. Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed mentioned this in his comment at the summit.
Private and public debt has reached new heights. Today, in most low-income countries, the headaches of government is not to think about development, but to think about how we can manage debt. All our effort is to manage debt instead of focusing on development. As if dealing with all these crises were not difficult enough, we also faced devastating climate effect.
Meanwhile, according to Senegalese President Macky Sall, a coalition of countries will be providing 2.5 billion euros to his country so that it increases its share of renewable energies and installed capacity to 40% by 2030. It's a deal similar to South Africa's with a Just Energy Transition Partnership backed by Germany, France and the European Union, the United Kingdom and Canada. Other speakers on the summit, such as the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, says the international community must look at ways of introducing a global carbon pricing to accelerate the transition to a lower carbon economy. While Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, told the summit the IMF has reached its target of making $100 billion in special drawing rights available for vulnerable countries.
And of course, work on making the world a better place for everybody.
Now let's get down to further brass tacks. Ini John Meko, our business correspondent, is with us to give us an idea of how the world of business has been affected by the Ukraine conflict. Good morning, Ini.
Good morning.
Ini, with the sanctions regime against Russia hanging over their heads, with the specter of further sanctions being called for by different quarters, including the European Commission and the EU, the country of Serbia has signed a memorandum of understanding, as you revealed, with Hungary for construction pipelines for Russian oil. Now, this seems like a ray of light for the Russians.
Yeah, it sounds like a ray of light, and it sounds like a state of uncertainty for Hungary, because, you know, Hungary is part of the EU.
Yes.
Yeah, and they are very much against the war that Russia is carrying on in Ukraine.
As a matter of fact, Hungary is being threatened by the United States and other countries over their position with Russia.
Yeah.
And there are a number of factors that are being put into play against Hungary that could happen. And this doesn't seem to help Hungary's cause
at all, exactly.
as far as their posture with the support for Ukraine, even though they have ties of a serious nature with Russia.
Yeah, so their relationship with Serbia also puts them in a much tighter stance.
Okay.
So, of course, we know that EU is trying to cut off everything that has to do with Russia, or gas, and all of that. So now giving an alternative to Russia for revenue obviously puts them in a much tighter position. So, but you know, Serbia and Hungary, they do have a border, they share a border. And Serbia has, they've signed a lot of treaties with Russia. So even though they're not enemies with Ukraine, but they have some pacts in paper with Russia. So they have to help Russia, you know. So they're building this pipeline to help transport Russian oil. It might go through EU, which is where Hungary comes in, but of course they want to send it outside the European Union and still keep Russia's oil, you know, in sales and all of that. So, like the threat you talked about, and I think this week there were still talks of the new sanctions against Russia. But it becomes more and more difficult for even the West and the EU and the talk of sanctions, because you now have your close allies thrust into the middle of all of it, and they have to. You can't be enemies with everybody. You don't have a war going on with Serbia. You have good relations with them, and you share a border, and they come to you as a neighbor, you know, with a pact. Now, I'm talking about Hungary now.
Yeah, okay,
so what do you do? Do you say, oh, no, I'm not going to deal with you, or I'm going to turn your enemy, and they're just at your border, and you have a lot of, you know, you have a lot of Hungarians staying in Serbia, and vice versa.
Right.
Even in Russia, too, a lot of Russians stay in Serbia. So it's a very tight-knitted community, and that's why when they say the world is a global village, it's not just in words. These are some of those very practical examples. And remember, we've talked here about how the EU and even America on a secondary level, still purchases oil from Russia because the EU will buy refined oil from India. Meanwhile, India got the crude from Russia.
Right.
So eventually...
So the third-party country situation.
Yeah, so I mean, you might say, oh, you purchased this from India, but do you want to make a little bit of investigation and see where that crude actually came from? It's the same one that you're sanctioning, that you put a price cap on. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for these sanctions to hold practical, you know, for it to be imposed and all of that. And you don't want to make enemy with all of the world. And that's why you see even the West turning a blind eye to countries like India and China that are openly buying this crude and still having tight relationship with Russia. We talked about how the yuan is being sold in the currencies market in Russia, how they are now giving out bonds, selling out bonds, or about to sell out bonds with yuan. So how come they have not sanctioned China? How come they've not sanctioned India? You know, and now we have countries like Saudi Arabia also importing crude from Russia.
So is there anything OPEC can do about it? Because if this pipeline is constructed for Russian oil from Serbia through Hungary, what does this mean for the larger picture for oil supply around the world?
So, and thank God I just mentioned the issue of Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
These are the giants of OPEC. Russia is part of OPEC Plus, which is an extension of OPEC. You know, so they're also part of the decision makers. You cannot really exclude them. You know, and they're also major players in OPEC. So, I mean, how do you want to punish yourself? You know, and now that they have close relationships with countries like Saudi Arabia, who are the spokesperson, you know, the voices of OPEC, they will certainly have some favor coming from there. And I don't see the United States sanctioning Saudi Arabia or sanctioning all members of OPEC and all of that, you know. So that's why I'm saying that it's just getting increasingly difficult. Yes, we might have the sanctions on papers, we might have suggestion of how Russia can be sanctioned and secondary sanction and all of that, but actually implementing it becomes more and more difficult, because when you turn a country, close a door to a country, the country has to survive, its people. I mean, look at what's going on with countries like Poland, with their farmers and all of that. They have the great heart and intention to help Ukraine, but not at the detriment of their farmers. Which is why they had to, some of them now have subsidies to help the farmers also bring down the price of their commodities so that they can compete favorably with Ukraine, Ukraine grains. You know, so it's...
So the dilemma is that it can tend to be impractical.
Most of it, or no, maybe not most of it, but some of those sanctions are becoming impractical.
In spite of that, there's also agitation that these countries who are supporting Russia indirectly by being the third-party countries through which Russian goods and produce is evacuated should stop that, and that will further enforce the sanctions against Russia. We don't know how that's going to work.
Yeah.
But Russia is seeing a steady growth in food export.
Yeah.
How so?
So it's poultry.
Isn't the grain part of the food that they're going to stop?
Yeah, well, yes, of course, food is part of the grain. But in this case, it's talking about the group of food they call halal.
Okay.
That's food that is permitted by the Islamic,
Okay.
So food export.
Like for the Jews, if it's kosher, then you can eat it, but if it's not, you can't.
You know, that kind of a thing.
Halal,
so Russia is the largest meat producer, and most of the countries, you know, that purchase from them actually have some of those poultry products which they shouldn't consume.
Okay.
So now Russia has to look, you know, further to try and sell it out, get new customers, especially because those close to them, like the EU, who used to be their clients and their customers, now have cut off from them. And even when it's not being cut off, you know, part of their request for the grain deal is that, yes, you have said we can still export our food, but insurance and logistics companies do not want to deal with us because of the threat of secondary sanctions. So they now now, just as they're doing with oil, we see even countries like Afghanistan, you know, coming to them now, turning away from Iran, their closest suppliers. They now look further because of the attractiveness of the price. So now Russia also has to look further, not just for its oil, but also for its poultry. And it seems they are getting what they want. Some clients, people are purchasing it, and it's giving them hope that their exports might find a balance, at least in that area.
So this growth is beyond Europe. It's possibly to other countries as well.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, all of those Iran and all of that. You know, people who normally, or countries who normally do not have a positive relationship with the West. Before now, you know, friend of your friend and an enemy of my enemy is my enemy and all of that. That seems to be, you know, the principle that they're adopting now, and it seems to be working for them. We still see their revenue up there. We still see... is
that why the ruble seems to be... Well, recently there was a decline in the value of the ruble.
Yeah, but I mean, with all of this, it's steadily, you know, gaining value again, just at least to be stable. It's not as uncertain as those days, you know, when the war just started and a lot of reactions, or probably in the early days of the war, since the West just talked about packages, new sanctions, you know, you'd have seen the ruble dip and, you know, a lot of changes, but shock absorber or, you know, people have just been like, okay, we've heard this before. I know that Russia will get through, so let's just keep it steady. You know, so there's kind of a steady movement now in the Russian economy.
One wonders how much of planning went into this pre-conflict by Russia. It doesn't seem as though they're making it up as they go along, because they seem seem to be.
Don't forget, they took the war to Ukraine.
Exactly.
So, and these are, I mean, if you read about Putin, then you would know that he's a very strategic person. Even if he is not himself, he ensures he gets the strategists together and they put things together, you know.
People forget Putin has a background in economy.
Yeah, and they have, but
in his early days.
But they have a very brilliant mind for the CBN governor. She's a brilliant mind, you know, and she's been helping Putin to manage the economy, push out buffers and palliatives where necessary, you know, to
really. So that's one of his trump cards.
Yeah, that is. You need to read about her. She's really brilliant.
Okay, we'll do that. Thank you, Ini.
Thank you.
Much obliged, Ini John Mekwa. From there, finally, the Court of Arbitration for Sport says that Kamila Valieva, her doping case hearing involving the Russian anti-doping agency, RUSADA, and the International Skating Union and World Anti-Doping Agency will be held from September 26th to the 29th. Now, Russian Valieva tested positive for a banned substance called trimetazidine at the Russian National Championships in December 2021, but the result was only made known on February 8, 2022, a day after she helped her team win gold at the Beijing Olympics. The ISU had lodged an appeal to the CAS Sport highest court after a Russian investigation found the teenager not guilty of a doping infraction, despite acknowledging she failed a drug test. During the Beijing Games, the International Olympic Committee, IOC, decided no medals for the team figure skating event will be presented until Valieva's case had been resolved. Much obliged for your company on our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thanks to all our guests as well. Have a great weekend and see you next week.